Hi, I'm Annmarie Worthington, and I will be teaching the class on teaching middle schoolers navigating the argumentative years. I've been homeschooling for about 23 years, which makes me older than I want to admit. I have 4 children, and 2 have already graduated. Another one is going to in a year, and I've got a 13-year-old. So I've been doing this for a while. I'm not perfect, and you won't be either, but I would love to share with you some of the things I have learned in my journey. So I'm going to share this PowerPoint with you, which will be much more interesting to look at than me. All right. So I wanted to start by telling you the philosophy I come from when it comes to education, because there are lots of different ways of homeschooling. There are unschoolers, there are Charlotte Mason methods, there are traditional schools at home, and I tend to do the classical education model. And I may give a brief overview of that really quickly, but as you can see in the bottom of this slide, there's an essay by Dorothy Sayers called The Lost Tools of Learning. You can find it easily online, free on a PDF, that goes into this much more in depth. So classical education is basically broken down into the years that follow the child's natural bent of learning. So in the early elementary school years, we call that the grammar stage or the parrot years. And that is when kids are great at memorizing and parroting back, and they'll repeat things you say, and they're learning by listening and rote memorization, and it's a great time for them to learn their times tables and history dates and things like that, or memorize poems. And so those usually happen in the elementary years. They're not great at abstract thinking then, but it's a great time for them to get lots of facts down that you can help them sort out as they get older. Now, we're going to be talking about this middle group called the logic stage, called the PERT years. And you may have noticed as your kids hit these grades that they start becoming both more confident and more insecure at the same time, which throws them into very tumultuous moods and attitudes, and their hormones and puberty aren't helping that at all. And they start to argue a little more than they used to. Instead of worshiping mom and dad, they're questioning everything that you tell them. They think you're out to get them. They think you're trying to make their lives miserable. And so these are difficult years to navigate for them as well as for you. I remember when my oldest was first going through this, and he was sitting down at the piano and playing this beautiful Beethoven sonata, but he had tears running down his face. He was about 13 years old. And I came up and I said, "What's wrong?" And he went, "I have no idea." And that's what's going on with them. They have no idea. And so this stage is a very important stage that helps them learn how to navigate a world that is both new and exciting and scary for them. Then the third stage is in high school. And after they've developed this logic and they've started answering what they believe about the world, this is the years where we have called the rhetoric stage. And they can start learning how to present their ideas well. It's when I would typically teach formal rhetoric, so they learn how to do great speeches, and we read a lot of great speeches, and we want them to be able to express their ideas at this time. Now, we're going to focus on that middle group. And so I have a philosophy that I teach formal logic in these years, because if they're going to argue with me, they need to be able to do it properly and have great arguments that can beat mine. And so I'm happy with that. And so if you don't know formal logic, that's okay. There are lots and lots of resources out there. If you're okay with taking a book and doing it on your, doing it with your child together and learning together, then Classical Academic Press has some great books on logic. If you would rather have your child watch video lessons and do the workbook, and maybe you can sit and listen to the lessons with them, then Roman Roads Media has a great introductory logic course for that. And there's other resources too. There's plenty of them out there. So you can just do a Google search on logic courses, and there will be lots of curriculums that come up in your search, and ask some other homeschoolers what they love and what they use. Now, in the logic stage, I wanted to point out this verse in Proverbs. Now, at first, it looks like a contradiction. And I think that has more to do with the translation from the Hebrew than what God actually meant. So the first part of it says, answer not a fool according to his folly, lest thou also be like unto him. Then right after that it says, answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own conceit. Now, this isn't actually a contradiction as much as it sounds. The first part is saying, don't answer the fool like a fool. Don't be foolish in the way you respond to foolish behavior. So if your child is being unreasonable and yelling at you and telling you you don't understand them and you're never fair, this is not the time for you to get frustrated and start yelling at them and telling them they never listen to you and they're being selfish. So you don't want to answer a fool as their folly is. So you don't want to copy their folly. But the second part, answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own conceit, is equally important. You don't want to leave your kids in that kind of fallacious behavior. And so you want to learn how to talk to your kids and get them thinking more clearly about the way they're storming about, is what I call it. Now, how you do that is easier said than done. It is important that you feed yourself spiritually. If your tank is empty and you have nothing left, it is going to be very hard for you to be the loving, patient, righteous mama that I know you want to be. And so make sure you're reading your scriptures every day and make sure you're praying a lot for yourself and for your children. And when your kids are in the middle of a storm, you stay calm. I always think of that passage where the storm is raging and Jesus and the disciples were on the boat and the apostles came down to him and said, don't you care about us? Because Jesus was fast asleep during this storm. And so in the midst of the storm of your children's hormones, I want you to be that calm, like the Savior, this is going to be okay kind of parent. It's not the time in the middle of the storm to tell them about how foolishly they're thinking and how unreasonably they're behaving. You need to give them a moment to calm down, get by themselves, and then after they've had a moment to come back to their senses a little bit, that's the time to talk to them about what's going on and how you're actually doing what you're doing because you love them and not because you've made it your personal goal to make their lives miserable. My youngest was getting frustrated with me because I wouldn't let him do certain things. I wouldn't let him play video games until he'd done certain things around the house, and he felt that was unfair and was very angry, and he had this stormy moment, and I told him I needed him to take a minute and just go upstairs and calm down. And he came back down a few minutes later and he said, in the middle of it happening, it feels like you're trying to kill puppies. But now that I'm calmed down, I know you're not trying to kill puppies. I know you're trying to help me. And so we talked about a way to help him remember when he's feeling tumultuous that I will just say to him, I'm not trying to kill puppies, and it helps him get a little calmer sometimes. So they need little cues to help them realize what's going on. And you have to explain to them they're going through a lot. Their body's changing, their hormones, especially boys, will make them angry when they don't know why they're angry from that testosterone. And girls will cry and think they're ugly and think nobody cares. And it's just part of what their body is changing into. And so in the middle of these times, don't be too hard on yourself because you're probably doing better than you think. You're not going to be perfect. And if you're going to try to be perfect, then you're always going to be disappointed. No one is perfect except the Savior. And if you're thinking about that, our Heavenly Father is perfect, but how many rebellious children does he have? And so you're not going to be perfect and your children are not going to be perfect. And you need to just accept that and just pray and keep going. Just keep going, but do keep your tank full. Now, one thing that's important is, especially if you're new at homeschooling, you're probably overwhelmed. And I think this year we have more new homeschoolers in 1 year than we've had before because a lot of parents are keeping their kids out of school while the pandemic is going on, and then they'll reevaluate afterward. I don't want you to try to do everything I am saying here today at once this year. A lot of it will be new, and just pick one or two things that you can focus on. And it's okay that there's going to be things you don't know. And the good thing about that is you can find out the things you don't know. And this is a quote by Socrates that I love. It said, "Some things I have said, which I am not altogether confident, but that we shall be better and braver and less helpless if we think that we ought to inquire than we should have been if we indulged in the idle fancy that there was no knowing and no use in seeking to know what we do not know. That is a theme upon which I am ready to fight in word and deed to the utmost of my power." So even though there is a lot that you're going to have to teach them that you may not feel confident about right now, all of it is knowable. All of it is learnable. And you can do hard things and your kids can do hard things. Just take it a little at a time and don't try to get it all at once. Okay, so we're going to be talking mostly about dialectic learning. And this is the art of investigating or discussing the truth of opinions. We want our children to start asking questions, to define terms, to compare ideas, to recognize patterns and rules. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to use the Socratic method. And that simply means asking them a lot of questions. So be involved in what they're learning. Don't just give them a workbook and say, "Here, do this thing on equations, and when you're done, let me know. And okay, here, read this book and answer these basic story chart questions." You want to really get into ideas at this part, because if you don't help them learn how to shape them properly, the world will. And you don't want that happening. Now, I'm going to focus most of my time on reading, because that is the foundation to every other academic discipline. If they cannot become good, thoughtful readers, then they're going to have trouble with science. They're going to have trouble with history. They're going to have trouble with everything. Reading helps them learn to think, and so you want them to be able to do it well. And there's a quote here, and I think it's from Leigh Bortins, who I'll talk about later. But past age 10, children read stories to understand the world around them. They're wrestling with big ideas, and we need to help them ask good questions. Now, I like to do this with conversations, and I want the kids to have conversations with the books themselves, and then we can have conversations together. And then they'll start having those conversations with their friends. I loved hearing my oldest daughter. I overheard her talking about something she'd read in Xenophon, one of the Roman historians, and then they got into this big discussion about something he had said, and it made my mommy heart so proud. But the first conversations they have to have is with the book themselves. And so I am not opposed to writing in books. I actually think it's a really good idea. And so you can teach your kids that it's okay to annotate their books. It's okay to write down questions or underline things that spoke to them. But sometimes the things in the books are so, the ideas are so big or so deep that they'll want to do more than just underline. And so I keep a commonplace book, and I try to encourage my children to do it. And that is just a book where they can write down quotes that meant something to them, or they can write down an idea that came up to their mind while they were reading, and they're wrestling with, why would someone do this? And is it okay to do this? And what would I do if someone did this? And just make sure you promise them that that commonplace book is private, almost like a diary, and you will never look at it. It's just for them to have a private conversation with their books. Now, the second conversation is with you, and that's where a lot of the real learning in your homeschooling begins. It's in these conversations about what they're reading and learning. And so it's very hard, I would say almost impossible, to read everything your children are going to read, especially if you have multiple children. If you're trying to homeschool 7 children, you're not going to be able to read every fiction book they're reading every year. Now, the good news is as you've been homeschooling for quite a while, you'll notice that you've read a bunch of these things and you've got them down pretty well by now. So let's say your child is reading a book like, oh, The Bronze Bow, and you haven't gotten to read The Bronze Bow. And so you know you need to talk to them about it, but you didn't get to those chapters. And so that's where you can sit down with your kid and say, okay, who are the characters in this chapter? Tell me about them. And they might tell you, well, there were these 2 guys, and you'll have to say, do you remember the guys' names? Well, I don't know. If your kids are like mine, I don't know, it's just some guys. Then you can go and look, say, okay, let's figure out what their names were. And were there any other characters in the Bronze Bow? Oh yeah, Jesus was there. Okay, and what choices did they have to make? Were they had to make any choices in this chapter? And oh, really, they had to make that choice? And it might be that one of them had to choose between following the man who was teaching them to fight the Romans or following Christ, who was telling them to love their enemies. And then you could say, well, what motivated the choice they made? Why did they make that choice? And were there any consequences for that choice? And what would you do if you were the guy that had to choose between there? And so here I might not have read that chapter, but by asking enough questions, you can get to some at least decently substantial conversations. Now, I want to be able to teach you, after you get past that and you're ready to go deeper, one of the things you want to teach your kids to do is look at definitions in books. And here I'm going to take an example of the book Number the Stars by Lois Lowry. And let's say we're talking about the definition of bravery in this. Now, we want to get our kids to look at genus and division, and that's a topic that comes up in logic too. And so those terms will be defined more for them in logic, but all genuses is more like a broader category. So if we're talking about bravery, you might say, what genus or other categories would bravery belong to? Like, what category would bravery fit into? And maybe they'd say virtues. And then you could say, oh, that's great. Bravery is a virtue. Okay, what are some other virtues that aren't bravery? And so they might say honesty or humility or kindness or gentleness. And so all of those are virtues. And then you could talk about the division. So how does bravery differ from the other virtues? What makes bravery different than the other things in its genus? And one thing they could say, and there's many different ways they can talk about this, is that bravery is an action that they do for someone else, which would be different than like self-preservation. And so you could talk about, okay, how did the Uncle Henrik in Number the Stars, how did he show bravery? Well, he hid Jews in his fishing boat to help them escape the Nazis and escape Denmark. And you could talk about what kind of sacrifices did he have to make to do that, and what made that brave? What would have happened if he'd have gotten caught? And so learning about definitions and how they differ is one way to help our students go deeper in what they're reading. Another, using the same book, would be comparisons. So you can do comparisons with people or comparisons with events. And let's start with people. We could say, okay, well, how does Uncle Henrik's bravery differ from Anne-Marie's bravery? They were both brave, but they were different in different ways. So what are the ways that their bravery was different? Or you could even talk about characters from two different books. Maybe you've read both Number the Stars and The Hiding Place, the Ten Boom family story about hiding Jews. And you could say, what are some of the similarities between Uncle Henrik and Corey and Bessie Ten Boom? What are ways they were different from each other in their personalities or in the way they tried to save the Jews? You could also compare events. You could say things like, how were the events in The Hiding Place and Number the Stars different? How did the circumstances of the people who were hiding the Jews, how did they differ? And how did that affect how they helped the people? You can even compare it with other time periods you studied or with current events. And like, especially with the Holocaust, there are a couple of things you could talk about with the Uyghurs in China. That's the regional Muslims that seem to be being rounded up in trains and taken off into camps like the Jews were. Or you could talk about the Yazidis that were captured and enslaved by the Muslims, and some of them are still enslaved right now, and compare that. Now, obviously, some of these topics are very deep, and you know your child best. If this would be going too much heartache for them to deal with at this tender point, then there are other ways you could talk about bravery without going into a lot of the atrocities. So pray and know your child. And I had at one point started to read the autobiography of Frederick Douglass to one of my children, who is the most sensitive of my children. At the same time, I had read it to some of my other kids. And so I started reading it and I realized this child is completely different. He burst, like I didn't even get past the second page and he was a puddle on the floor. And so I realized I'm gonna have to wait a couple of years for him. And so you know your kids, but you can make these comparisons without having to get as deep into maybe the enslavement of the Yazidis or something else. Another thing you can do in reading is teach them about relationship. So how did the character and setting and plot relate to one another and relate to what happened? So this year, my youngest and I are reading, our first book is Robin Hood. We started school Monday, then he got attacked by a dog, and we have put off school now until our next Monday. We've put it down as our worst first day of school ever, but he's getting a break this week. But we did get to the prologue of Robin Hood. And so as we were reading it, some of the things I asked him were, what character trait led to Robin doing something illegal? What made him an outlaw? And we talked about how it was Robin's pride when the men were making fun of him and calling him, you know, a weakling lad, and he wanted to prove that he was just as good as the older guys. And so he shot one of the king's animals, which was illegal and officially made him an outlaw. And then that pride snowballed into even bigger events where they said they were going to arrest him, and he started to run away. And then one of them shot an arrow at him, and he turned around and slayed the man with his arrow. He was better shot. But he did that because he was angry that that man missed, you know, he kind of brushed up against him with that arrow. And so he was brash and quick to anger. And so we talked about that second characteristic. What character trait led him to slaying someone? Well, that was his anger and his brashness. So pride and quickness to anger made Robin Hood an outlaw. And then we talked about the quote, what does it mean? I smote in haste, but I grieve in sore leisure. So he was quick to slay that man, but then he had to live with the guilt and the results of that and live in the forest in hiding from the law for the remainder of his life. And so those are the kind of things we talk about, how the character in this book put together with the setting of it's illegal to do anything with the king's animals, and that came together to form the plot of Robin Hood becoming an outlaw. Excuse me. Now, another thing you can talk about to your kids with reading is circumstance. If you were reading A Misfortune, Free Man, which is about an African prince who's brought over as a slave to this country, you want them to think about the causes of events by asking questions. And I put in here, it's okay if you guys don't have the answers, because you can find them together. And that's one of the great things about homeschooling, is you can learn together. So if you were to think, okay, well, what was going on in Africa that allowed the slave trade to happen to begin with? Because a lot of times it was Africans capturing Africans and selling them. So what was going on in Africa that made that kind of society seem okay? And then you could talk about who's capturing and selling the slaves, not just the Africans, but who was buying them from the Africans and then selling them elsewhere. What countries are buying the slaves? What is going on in those countries that made that possible? Slavery was a worldwide thing at that time. So what was the thinking of the people of that time that made slavery seem acceptable? And we want our kids to learn to evaluate history in context and not just by modern thinking, because humanity grows and we have to see how they grow. So what were they thinking then, and how did we grow from thinking it was okay to enslave someone to realizing that is not the way we treat our fellow human beings? And so, but they have to be able to ask questions. You don't need the dates of what were the dates of the African slave trade. What you really want to know is, why did the African slave trade happen? How can we keep that from happening again? And so those are the things you want to go into when it comes to reading. Now, writing is also important. And in the elementary years, I highly recommend Institute for Excellence in Writing. It's usually shortened to IEW, and it gives them tools to write without having them know what to write, because it's very hard for a kid to sit there and figure out, okay, I have to write an essay and I have to pick a topic. And so when we really want to teach them how to write, and now when they're in the logic stage, this is when they can begin to develop and explore their own ideas. And that's when I'll move from IEW, which gave them the tools to write well, to the Law's Tools of Writing, which teaches them how to explore and develop their own ideas. And so this gives them concrete tools to help them make comparisons and affirmative and negative and interesting kind of charts to learn how to develop their essays well. And the great thing about it is you can combine it with what you're learning. So let's say you're reading Robin Hood, or you're studying about the medieval times or the American Revolution. You can make the topics about what you're studying in other subjects and tie everything together. Now, history is huge. And I want to read this quote from Livy from the early history of Rome. And if you're looking at what's going on in our country right now, you can understand that now more than ever, our kids need to understand history. And I was heartsick to see some articles about the Chicago School Board asking to stop teaching history until they can rewrite some of the lessons. And I think that's actually the worst thing they could do, because you have to teach history at all times. But I'm going to read this quote real quick, and because my eyes are getting old and I'm tired, I'm going to zoom this up a little bit for me. This is Livy again. I invite the reader's attention to the much more serious consideration of the kind of lives our ancestors lived, of who were the men and women, and what were the means, both in politics and war, by which Rome's power was first acquired and subsequently expanded. I would have them trace the process of our moral decline, to watch first the sinking of the foundations of morality as the old teaching was allowed to lapse, then the rapidly increasing disintegration, then the final collapse of the whole edifice, and the dark dawning of our modern day, when we can neither endure our vices nor face the remedies needed to cure them. The study of history is the best medicine for a sick mind. In that record, you can find for yourself and your country both examples and warnings, fine things to take as models, base things, rotten through and through, to avoid. And there are a couple of things I wanted to point out in this quote. The first is that Livy had mourned the fact that they had stopped teaching their young their history. And he said that in the old teaching was allowed to lapse. And he expands on this later in the book, but he talked about how we didn't keep teaching our kids our history. And then everything, morality collapsed, and then everything else came after that. And so you want our kids to not shy away from history, but understand why things happened and how we can learn from the great things and stay away from, or even run away from, the things that we have seen are base failures, so we don't repeat history unnecessarily. Now, we've talked about going beyond dates before, and while they do need to know when something happened, it does no good if they don't, because they can't compare events in the world. But it's much more important they understand why something happened and the results of it. And so I'll give you an example of the French and American Revolution. So you could start thinking along the lines of, why did the American Revolution succeed while the French Revolution led to the Reign of Terror, which was absolutely horrific, and ultimately fail? And so, and that's actually an important question given our current events, because a lot of what you see in the people that are protesting now are going about it in the ways the French Revolution began instead of the ways the American Revolution began. And so it might do us good to look at, okay, well, that failed. Why did that fail? And if you don't know, that's okay. You can look it up and learn and compare it. Now, I am not a big believer in history textbooks. I am much big believer in going to original sources. And I think that's extremely important. Now, I'm not saying you can't use a curriculum. There are great curriculums out there that use original sources. Roman Roads Media is a great one. When you're studying Greek history, you read Herodotus. When you're studying Roman history, you'll read Livy. And so you're going to read the people who were there at the time. When you're studying American history, you're going to read the Federalist Papers. You're going to read Christopher Columbus's journal, not the excerpts from his journal that are taken out of context in textbooks, but what he was actually meaning in its context. And so you would ask questions going back to the American and French Revolution, and how did the leaders in both revolutions differ in their character, in their beliefs or their motivations. What were the motivations of Jefferson and Washington as opposed to LaMarche or some other people that were, well, you get the idea. So it's going beyond dates, it's asking questions, and it's okay if you don't know the answers because you're teaching your child how to learn. And so sometimes you teach them how to learn by learning yourself. And so you can go together and be willing to say to your child, you know, that's a good question. I don't have the answer. Let's find out and work on it together. And you don't have to learn everything all at once. You can take one bite at a time and get it. Now, that's one thing I want you to know right up front is, especially if you're brand new at homeschooling, don't try to do all of this at once. And if you can, try to tie in as much together. We do history chronologically, and so I try to line up my reading with the time period of history we're studying so we can tie those together. I also try to focus our writing lessons around what we're reading. If you have some kids in elementary school, Dr. Weil has just written a great science series that also goes chronologically in history. And so you see what the ancient Greeks and Romans were learning in science and the mistakes they made that led to better discoveries. And then when you get to the Industrial Revolution, he has one on the Industrial Revolution. And so that's a great thing you can tie in with your elementary school kids as well. But try to keep as many things together as you can to make connections more easily and make your life easier. And remember, you only have to stay one day ahead of them. And so if you're stressing out, it's okay if you need to take a day off, do some extra reading, and give them some other projects to do. And now I have some things on here for further study. One is The Lost Tools of Learning that I mentioned by Dorothy Sayers, and I told you could find that online. The other is this book, The Question by Leigh Bortins. It goes into much more depth into what I was teaching in this brief time in this video. And so if you want to learn much more about classical education for the middle years, she also has a book for the elementary and the high school years as well. But if you had to get just one and you have a middle schooler, get this one. And then the other book I wanted to mention, and I should have grabbed it off my shelf, is called Do Hard Things. It's a book written by teenagers. They were teenagers at the time. They're not anymore. Alex and Brett Harris, for teenagers. And the subtitle is A Revolution Against Low Expectations. And it's teaching teenagers that they can do hard things and have high expectations of themselves. Now, I am going to put my email in the comments, I hope, or in the description of this video. And if you have any questions, you can put them in the comments, and I'll be monitoring that for a few days. And then I'll try to keep coming back and monitoring it after a few days. So I'm happy to answer as many questions as you have. And I know you can teach your kids, and you're going to love learning with them. Thank you.